Hello, welcome to Exotic Garden UK, your Kris Weekly. We're in late October now and temperatures are normally diving down with some early frosts, but this year it's been incredibly mild over the last few days and everything in the garden with the winds has been drying out. So although we're well into autumn, it's still really important to water the tree ferns and the summer bedding if you want to continue it slowly growing for the next few weeks. So I get a good big watering can like this and I water every single tree fern. If it hasn't rained for 3 or 4 days, I'll give it a good soaking. And like I said, especially with the winds, it's really important to give it that soaking so they don't dry out. Well, on today's episode of Exotic Garden UK, we're going to be looking at a nursery in Norfolk which supplies exotic plants. We'll be looking at big bamboos in Sheffield and we'll be meeting an amazing couple who have created a fantastic garden in Norfolk. But first we're off to North Lincolnshire to visit Jane and Alan Scorer's exotic garden, which they've been tending to over the last 20 or 30 years. So welcome to Alan and Jane's garden here in North Lincolnshire, and it is truly a wondrous exotic garden in every sense of the word. It's got many areas of woodland and shade, but there's sunny areas, there's truly amazing exotic and tropical plants as well as traditional and cottage plantings as well. So let's take a look around this amazing garden.
We moved here the summer of 82, I should think. There was nothing here other than waist-high weeds, and it's had different styles. I was inspired by Will Giles, who is still, I'm a big fan of the late Will Giles, and I've been to his garden a couple of times and just absolutely knocked out by it. And so he was the inspiration. And so we started off in a very small way with a few tree ferns and cordylines and phormiums, the very commoner garden stuff, because there wasn't, when we first started off, there wasn't a massive availability of stuff. I mean, you can get all these plants from just about every garden centre now, but not back in the day. And it just remained relatively small until the winter of 2010-2011, where everything was devastated despite protecting the tree ferns and whatnot, and we lost virtually everything. All cordylines, phormiums, the lot. And so we had to start from scratch.
I really love flowering plants, so for me, I love salvias. I adore salvias and impatiens and hydrangeas. I think we're fairly eclectic in the plants that we use, and also because of the space we've had to fill, we've tended to have to use a lot of hardy filler plants. Things
good doers, as we call them.
Good doers. Things like Brunnera have been wonderful, Ligularia, and trying to get that sort of interesting foliage and quite exotic looking foliage, but I mean, just being absolutely bone hardy, because we bring a lot of stuff into the greenhouses, but they just get packed, there's no matter how much space you've got, you fill it. So we are fairly eclectic, I think, but the plants that I really, really enjoy, and I enjoy the propagation and everything to do with them really. So it's the salvias, particularly the good hardy salvias, which are just a lot easier to keep. And I've just recently got into hydrangeas in a big way, and I'm enjoying all the different flowers and leaf forms and things, and the impatiens too. We're a big group which is very interesting, and I don't know why they're not more widely grown, really, because they're very suitable for the type of gardening that we do.
I mean, I love ferns of all sizes, and you know, as you'll have noticed, there are probably hundreds of ferns, not hundreds of tree ferns, but hundreds of ferns, very hardy ferns, you know, rock, you know, you can rely on them every year, they come back year after year. And the tree ferns, I love them. Looking after them through the winter, very simple. I'll keep the fronds on. I don't usually cut them back until they're starting to look tatty in the new year. But a couple of handfuls of straw in the top of the fern, maybe, I call it a top hat, put something over the top of the straw just to keep the worst of the weather out, snow or rain or whatever. So, you know, hopefully the straw doesn't get solid with frost and whatnot, which could obviously damage the tops. But generally speaking, they're hard as nails.
We do have emergency buckets though, don't we?
Yeah.
A supply of emergency buckets.
Yeah. You know, bit of fleece sometimes if the forecasting is very low. But I mean, I reckon they'll take -10, no problem at all. The Cyathias they're more tender and they go into the greenhouse. But yeah, the good old Dixonia's great plant. The tree ferns, I try and water them every day, but that does not happen, you know, all the time, but every other day. And if it's hot weather, then every day, definitely. And the garden we split, well, all the watering, we split it between us, and it can be a pain in hot weather.
How many hours do you think?
Ooh.
3?
Yeah, 3 hours probably
yeah.
watering up everything, because we've got a lot of pots and stuff, so it can be a chore. It can really be a chore. But sometimes on a lovely day, you know, you just stood there with a hose or whatever.
Yeah, there are worse jobs to do, aren't there?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the inspiration we've got from visiting other gardens of a similar style, you know, and at first you see a garden which you think, crikey, this is, you know, way better than ours, but you take inspiration from that, you come back and you think, right, you know, we're going to do better.
Must do better.
Must do better. And whether or not we have done, well, we like it, so it doesn't really matter. But if other people like it, then that's fantastic. You know, we enjoy opening. We've opened our garden for our local open gardens in Winchton for many years now, and for the NGS 3 times.
3 times. Yeah.
You know, it's hard work, but very, very worthwhile, particularly if you're raising money for charity.
Now, in previous episodes, we talked about covering arid plants for winter that are planted out in situ. Those are the ones that are sort of half hardy to hardy. There are arid plants like these echeverias that I've got planted around my jabea that are not winter hardy and do need to be brought in. So it's time at the end of October to dig these up. So ideally use a little trowel, but in my big garden I don't know where I've put my trowel, so I've just got my spade and just go around there carefully. And they don't have a massive root ball, so you don't need to go down too deep, and just lift that up like so. And then all we do then is get a clean pot and basically place it in. There should be enough soil around. I'll just take off any weeds that are growing, give it a little shake, just check the roots are there, and they are. And that's all it needs. It's got really good gritty compost and soil there, and I'll just put a little bit of that in the base of my pot. And then all I'm doing is placing this in, and it's not going to be really growing too much over winter, it's just semi-dormant. So that's all it needs to be done. It just needs to be resting in a pot, and then this will go into the greenhouse along with the rest of the echeverias and aloes in this bed, and they'll stay like that until sort of March, April time, when they'll be brought out, and then come sort of by the end of April when most of the frosts have gone, these will be planted out in the garden. You may remember a couple of years ago we had a look around Joel Robinson's garden, who had a very large collection of arid plants. Well, he's moved to a new garden now, and we're going to have a quick sneak peek at what he's got in his new place. Now, you may remember a couple of years ago we paid a visit to Joel Robinson's garden on the East Pennines above Hebden Bridge. Beautiful countryside views, but lots of cold winter weather. It's pretty high up and exposed, but he's grown a remarkable array of arid plants, including cacti, aloes and agaves that are planted year round, most with protection to keep the rain and the snow off. But many of those are also kept fully outdoors as well. And this collection has grown over the years, and Joel has moved to a new location still close to the Pennines, and the move has only just taken place this year, and Joel's at the early stages of developing a new garden on a very sloping, steep site. So this is a sneak peek of what it looks like now, and we'll be returning to the garden probably next year to see how it's developing and see how those arid plants are being placed in the new space. Now, none of these arid plants on this bench should need watering through winter and early spring at all. They'll be left to dry out because they've still got some moisture in the soil from where they've been lifted, and then come early spring they'll probably need watering then, and then obviously they'll be brought out. Now it's time to visit another garden, and this time we're heading down to Sheffield to see Dr. Simon Olpin's garden, which has been creating for 30 years now, and it's full of exotic hardy plants.
Well, ever since I was a young boy, I had an interest in the natural world, and initially particularly interested in anything that crept and crawled, which is usually worms and small insects. And eventually, as I got a bit older, I got interested in plants and looked after my parents' house plants and killed most of those. And so that interest in plants grew and grew, and we moved here from Cambridge in 1987. The garden had virtually nothing in it at all at the time. It was just grass and a couple of fruit trees. The garden's 200 foot long at the back and 40 feet wide, so it was a completely open palette really for planting. At that time I'd got an interest, a very early interest in bamboos, and also I'd started to grow Trachycarpus palms for the first time. So I started to plant up the garden in the late 1980s and early 1990s, initially with a few palms and quite a few bamboos, but with some other plants and shrubs which came and went over time. But the garden slowly evolved into an exotic garden, which I could best achieve in what is quite a cold climate in Sheffield, being 450 feet above sea level, quite exposed to the wind, certainly in winter, and where obviously temperatures, even in summer, are not particularly high. They're not as high as they are in southeast England and in further south. So it's not the easiest British climate but to grow things in, but nevertheless we've got good air drainage because we're on a slope, so that does help in mitigating some of the lowest temperatures. So the garden's evolved over nearly 30 years, starting with very small palms and bamboos. Many of the shrubs I planted several large eucalyptuses, a number of acacias, a whole range of other exotic plants, some of which were hardy, some of which needed bringing in the winter. So initially I did grow a lot of bananas and cannas and colicaceas. They required a lot of work because as I say, I had to bring them out again in the spring and overwinter them. And eventually I've moved away from those sort of plants generally to things which are more permanently hardy. The garden is really predominantly an evergreen garden, which means it does get hit quite hard in the winter, but it means I do have some degree of all-round interest. The garden can look as good in December as it can in July, virtually. But once the winter gets going, most winters after Christmas, obviously things tend to deteriorate a bit, depending on the winter. But come back again, particularly once we get into June and July, things green up a lot. There is some loss of leaves from the bamboos, and occasionally there's a few other deciduous shrubs. So, as I say, the garden has a theme now as well. So I've got a lot of Southeast Asian plants as well, a lot of bamboos, Scheffleras, the umbrella trees, which I've found to be, many of which are hardy in Sheffield. A lot of Himalayan bamboos, particularly the Berindas, and obviously the Chinese bamboos, a lot of Phyllostachys as well. So that's a general theme to the garden, and hopefully as we move through some of the individual plants we can talk about those as we come to them. The garden is mature now with some of the bamboos, which are up to 35 feet tall, and the palms have as much as 20 foot of trunk, having been planted with just very small, less than a foot or 18 inches of trunk. So that's the garden in essence as we first describe it. So these two trees you see behind me are Schefflera rhododendronifolia. Both specimens are around 8 to 9 years old, and they've tolerated all the winter weather that we've had in Sheffield since that time. We've certainly not had very cold temperatures, in the sense we probably had a -7, but nothing below that in that period of time. But you can see they've grown very well in what is a very sunny position. To the far right, only though out of your view, is a Schefflera impressa, which is the same species, the same plant as rhododendronifolia, but it's a form that was collected back in the early 1990s. And I planted a small plant of Schefflera impressa back then, so it's been in this garden for over 20 years and has taken all the winter weather that Sheffield has thrown at it, including the -12 and huge snowfalls of up to a foot at a time of snow, which we've had over the years. So both have proven, or rather the species itself has proven very hardy for Sheffield. They're collected in Nagaland, these two behind me, which is in North India, and also they grow in South China, just over the border from Nagaland into China, in mixed deciduous woodland. They're nice plants. They have an unusual leaf, the umbrella leaf. They're a big group of tropical, subtropical and mild temperate climates. And you can see on the right here is Schefflera macrophylla, which is a favourite of mine. I've had this plant about 3 years now. It's not known to be phenomenally hardy. It's had about -6 here without any real damage. I'm hoping that it will continue with me for some years, but of course it depends on what weather conditions are thrown at it. I may try and cover it if we have some very cold conditions, but certainly the Scheffleras are generally, many species seem to be hardy within Sheffield. I have also a Schefflera subalpina, which is about 13 feet tall, which seems to be fully hardy in Sheffield, and has again taken all the weather that's been thrown at it in the last 20 or so years.
Wow, what a garden Simon's created over the last 30 years in Sheffield, which again is a cold northerly climate, and he relies on a structure of hardy evergreens, and that's something I'm trying to create in many parts of my garden. So here we have the bamboo hedge, which provides some shelter to all the tender plants, and it's also evergreen, so it looks good all year round. And in front of it I've got a loquat tray, and I've got a Schefflera macrophylla, not quite as impressive as Simon's, but it's getting there. Right, time to see something A bit different, but equally as impressive.
It's an Agave Americana. It's about 40 years old. It was brought back from Yugoslavia in around 1984, something like that. And then it was planted here in 2000. And it was protected for the first few winters. And then after that, it weren't protected at all. The bad winters at 2010 and I think about 2014, something like that, didn't affect it at all. It started flowering probably about March this year, and since then it's grown about a foot a day, and as you see it now, it's nearly flowering. Neighbours think it's a bit odd, and they've never seen anything like it, and they just says, when's it going to stop growing? But other than that, not a lot, 'cause they're used to seeing it as they walk by. But yeah, it's certainly different.
Now, wasn't Stephen's Agave Americana absolutely amazing? Far more impressive than my specimen here in the garden, which has got a long way to go before it flowers, even if I get it to that stage. So, Agave Americana here is grown in the gravel bed along with some other agaves and arid plants. And I put a shelter over mine, so I'll be putting a Perspex polycarbonate shelter on a wooden frame, 4 wooden posts around here, and that will stay on until probably next March, April time. What's so impressive about Stephen's specimen, and he has lots of other agaves in his back garden, which I didn't show in that film, is that they're just grown basically in general garden soil, which hasn't really been improved. So they've been grown as small plants, planted out in your bog standard sort of clay soil, and they've just grown away, and they've been planted out for many years, and they've got through the winter 2010, which was absolutely atrocious, which most of the country saw -10. Some areas went down to -18, -20. So it's really remarkable. There's Agave Americana, inland UK, up north, has actually got to flowering size without any protection whatsoever, and now it's in full bloom. And yes, it will die after flowering, but it's got many more agaves around the garden that will continue growing for many years to come. Now it's come to that time of year where we've got to reluctantly dig up our Ensete bananas, whether it be Ensete morellii or in this case Ensete Geneva. And I've gone through many times the different processes and ways of overwintering these bananas, but what I'm going to do with this one is chop off all the foliage, dig it up, shake off most of the soil and pot it up in fresh compost and put on my heated bed over winter, so it goes and roots for a while on that heat, and then I'll let it go semi-dormant in the greenhouse. So unfortunately it's time to get the old bread knife out and remove the foliage. So we don't need any of this foliage really, we'll just chop all the leaves off pretty close to the main stem. And it's surprising when you take off these huge leaves, which can be, you know, a good 2 meters tall, approaching 3 or 4 meters in extreme cases, the actual trunk might not be that large and it might not be too heavy, so we can repeat this process year after year until it gets too big to lift, and at which point we either have to leave it in the ground to succumb to the winter, or we can propagate it, and I've done a propagating video of Ensetes before. So that's it, doesn't take long, and I don't need this middle leaf either at the moment, so that can come off. And then all we need to do is dig this up with a spade, which isn't too difficult, because although it's pretty sturdy in the ground, the roots are very fleshy and easy to dig through. And so we'll just cut pretty close, you don't want a massive root ball. So we'll just dig around it like so. And this will come up, like I said, pretty easily. And what you find at this time of year, because you get awesome rains, you know, it's a nice dry and windy day today, lots of water stores in the base where the leaves attach to the main trunk, and if you leave that water in there, it can lead to rot over winter. So what we do before we take it into the greenhouse, and if you're dry storing this is really important, is we tip it over like so. If we can pick it up, let that water drain out. And then if you're dry storing that, you will turn it upside down, put it somewhere dry for a few days, maybe up to a week, before we bring it into the greenhouse. In this case, I'm just going to shake off most of that soil, let it drain for a few hours, then we'll bring it into the greenhouse to overwinter it. Now, I've got another 15, 20 big onsets to dig up, bring into the greenhouse for winter. But here's what's coming up in the rest of today's episode. We'll be visiting an astonishing, mainly arid garden in Norfolk. I'll be planting bulbs for spring colour, and we'll take a second trip down to Sheffield to see some amazing bamboos and winter 2010 survivors. But before all that, we'll take a trip down to Norfolk, down to Norwich, to see an exotic nursery producing thousands of plants for us exotic gardeners.
Right, my name's Carl. I have an online nursery called Tropical. We're based in Norwich, just outside Norwich in Ratkeith, and we sell and post plants all over the UK. Up until last year we were posting out to Europe, but since all the Brexit changes we only now post to UK addresses. Plant wise, I would say our most popular plants we sell colocasias, bananas and alocasias. This year we've tried to bring in a few more shrubs, house plants, due to the house plant boom last year. The very first plants I used to sell were carnivorous plants, so we do have a range of carnivorous plants as well, which is really what got me into the whole growing plant side. A little nursery I used to work at, when I left school, they grew lots of normal plants, roses, bedding plants, that sort of thing. And I was trying to encourage them to grow something a little bit more unusual, but they weren't really that interested. So I took it on myself to source some carnivorous plants, which I actually grew to sell, then used to propagate. Found myself selling them to a few other local plant people in the area, and from that I bought my very first polytunnel, which I do still have, although it's not up at the minute. It sort of made me, I suppose at a young age, made me a little bit of pocket money, which then grew over the years into what we've got now. We find our main probably selling season is probably March till about now, sort of like September time. Peak time is probably bang in the middle of that. So we do notice February we have a few orders come in. As soon as you get the final frosts finish is when we really start to get a lot of orders come in. And then as soon as the nights start pulling in is when we tend to tail off a little bit, although we do still sell all year round. I think people do like me, I buy plants all year round. If it isn't plants, I buy seeds. So we do sell seeds as well this time of year. We should have our first lot of seeds coming in probably in the next few weeks, which we then packet them up and then we sell them on. This year we're going to give a bit more advice on how to germinate. We do a lot of our own germination. Every plant requires a different process. So we've sort of taught ourselves, or we just research into it, which works best for us. We've now got our own propagators and stuff, so we've sort of invested quite a bit of money this year, especially into growing our own. So we're going to try and pass on some of that knowledge to our customers, so you can grow your own, hopefully as successfully as we can. Although we don't have success every time, like everybody knows. We could try 100 different seeds and none come up, but that is part of it, I suppose. So it's not just you, it is us as well. We've been doing it for years. In a few years' time, I'd like to say that most of our stock is homegrown. There's some things we can't grow ourselves, so we have to buy it in. Some things you can find easily one year, next year you can't find it. So I try and keep as much as I can of my own stock. to just propagate again. And my plan also is to try and focus on smaller plants at a more reasonable price than to buy big plants in. If I have everything too big, I won't have a lot of stock and a lot of variety, which is what my plan is, have more variety, smaller plants, and obviously cheaper prices as well. Over the last 2 years, tried to make our packaging as eco-friendly as possible. So obviously our boxes are cardboard. We've moved over from plastic tape to craft tape, which also has our own branding on it. Documents and clothes slips are now made from paper rather than plastic. The only plastic we do use is a biodegradable poo bag. We find that they fit most of our pots quite nicely. Although they're not plastic free, they are, biodegradable, so it's better than using cling film, which I see a lot of people use. So all our packaging is either biodegradable or recyclable. And this year we have also, to some change, our compost. Most of you are probably aware that there's a ban on peat in 2024. So we've tried to get one step ahead, and we've actually now stopped buying in peat, and we use a peat-free compost, which is predominantly bark, I believe, composted bark. So we've now been trialling that. We mix our own compost up, so we use a bag of that. We add perlite, vermiculite, slow release fertiliser, mini chip bark, and we've been experimenting with different, depending on what plant it is, what mix we use. And we're also now using recycled or I think they're biodegradable pots. So the pots are no longer just plastic. A lot of the pots we buy in now have been recycled, but the ones we've got, they're like a brown biofiber type material. So I think they should compost away, but that's only on our small plants. But this is something we're doing just to try and help the environment as much as we can. One of the biggest things I find is the plants that we buy in are either wrapped in plastic, the trays are plastic, and they're all single use. And it's one of my biggest things, that I really want to try and change. I don't know how. I know there's a few online petitions to try and get nurseries to not grow stuff in this much plastic, but I don't know how else they can do it. I mean, obviously cardboard and paper will get wet, so it needs to be something that's going to withstand that. There's got to be a way around it, but the more we can do, the better. And all the plants I grow, one of my favourites is probably my Solanum pyrocanthum. Could be, some people call it Solanum pyrocanthos, but it's a member of the tomato family. Really, really spiky, vicious, turquoise leaves covered in orange spikes. We've sold quite a few of them on the website, but it is a plant that actually I first came across is in one of my friend's gardens, Kevin Scales. Quite a popular guy on the tropical plant pages. He had an open garden and he had this plant sitting on his table in a terracotta pot. Found the name, managed to get some seed and grew it myself, and constantly have loads of them now because they're quite easy to grow from seed. But yeah, just a really cool plant, looks really quite vicious really. I actually had one of the spikes stuck on my finger for a couple of weeks until I managed to get it out the other day. So yeah, not a nice plant, but it's a pretty cool plant. And I think the tropical plant trend seems to be getting, more and more popular. I mean, my other landscaping company, we've started to do a few more tropical jobs where we design, landscape and plant tropical style gardens, and I can only see that getting more and more popular. It seems quite popular on TV as well. 3 or 4 of the gardening programs I watch, they all seem to feature tropical plants and they all seem to get quite good responses. Everybody wants to be surrounded by plants that remind them of holiday, and especially how the last 2 years have been with people not managed to get away as much. Making your own garden like a holiday is probably the next best thing. Probably not, cost-wise, probably just as much as it is to go abroad, but you've got it forever pretty much, and you can constantly change it. which is what I'll do here, my own garden. It will evolve. You know, we've only been here since March, and you know, I want to change this. I use a lot of my own plants for propagation as well. My girls will also hopefully get into it a lot more. They already seem quite interested. So I've got 2 girls. Sienna is the eldest, she's 4, and Talia is 2. And you know, having my garden set up with tropical plants, they're only going to learn more and more about tropical stuff and hopefully help me in the future.
I think Carl's idea of using reusable, recyclable pots and peat-free for his potting medium is a great idea, and that's something hopefully more and more nurseries and individual gardeners will follow. Here in the greenhouse I am recycling pots, so these are just they are plastic pots, but I've used these probably 3 or 4 times already. I give them a good wash out, and I'm going to use them again to pot up some of my cuttings from my Hydropod, and I'll be doing a full review on the Hydropod in an upcoming episode. But if we just take a look in here, these have been in now for 2.5 weeks. We can lift out a cutting and we can see it's got lots of lovely roots and little rootlets coming off the major roots all up and down the stem. So I'll just take off this collar, which I will reuse for more cuttings that will go in the Hydropod. And this is a wonderful silver-leaved Plectranthus, and this will be potted up now in, again, a peat-free compost. And peat-free composts get a lot of flack for not being that good in terms of growing on plants. Well, I'll be doing a review of lots of different peat-free composts and different mixtures later on in the series, but for now we've just got a basic, this is a Miracle Grow peat-free compost, and I'm not going to add anything to this because I want this cutting to very, very slowly grow over winter. Don't want it to put lots of energy into growing new leaves, so we're not adding lots of nitrogen-rich fertilizer or anything like that. So I've half filled this with compost. I'll just place this in here like so, and then just fill it up with more compost and just firm that in. And because it's come out of the nice warm Hydropod, where it's been nice and warm and obviously wet, this will get a really good watering now, and I'll put this on a heat mat for a while just to settle and acclimatise this plant, and then eventually it'll just go on to the staging in the warm part of the greenhouse, and it'll stay like that again until about May next year, where I may take more cuttings of this, or I might plant this out in the garden in its final position. And by the looks of it, I've got many more cuttings to pot up. But before I do that, it's time to check out another garden.
Here we are in not so sunny Norfolk at Crete Lodge Exotic Garden. As you can see, surrounded by some exotic stuff. This is our arid area. We've got lots of agaves, yuccas, cacti all planted out, which stay out all the year round, although they do get some protection over winter, keep them looking pristine. We moved here in, I suppose, mid-90s, so we've had quite a few years working on it. We plant quite a range of stuff, lots of palms, sheffies, all sorts of stuff really. There was nothing here when we moved here, say a few bachelor trees, that was about it. We're on the side of what was a quarry, so very sandy, well drained soil. This bank is south facing, so it's ideal for what's planted on there. We started off in the top garden when we first moved here. We had a lot of work to do on the house to start off with, and until we got sidetracked in the garden, and the garden's taken over really.
it may be raining here, but I think this is one of the most impressive parts of the garden. This is a main arid bed, and it's built up on this big flint and shingle banking, and both sides we have a wonderful array of arid plants. And these aren't just small specimens, these are absolutely huge specimens. We've got things in front of me like this Yucca linearis and rostrata, which are twice as tall as me, so well over sort of 3 meters tall, 4 meters tall, even higher for this linearis. We've got a Faxonia here, which is over 2 meters tall. We've had lots of agaves that have been flowering, see the dead stems over there. And then we've got huge specimens of Agave montana, lots spread about the garden, both sides of this path. And it's not just the common species like the montanas and americanas. We've got really select, hard to find species and forms as well. And it's absolutely a treasure trove of arid plants, all dotted about the garden, but especially in this area. One of the absolutely outstanding parts of the garden, which really took my breath away when I first saw it, is this grove of Tetrapanax papyrifera rex. It's so hard to describe to you how enormous these individual plants are, but they have produced an absolutely huge canopy that's completely enveloping me. And these stems must be at least 5 meters tall, if not taller, and the growth rate is phenomenal. I've got one to my left here, which is 4 years old, and it's already about 3.5, 4 meters tall. Truly incredible growth of the Tetrapanax rex in this area. And there's probably about 10, 15 individual large stems, and the leaves at the top, they haven't branched out the stems too much, so the big tall stems, but then when they have opened up the leaves at the top, it covers the full area. So now I'm in absolutely, well, it's a deluge of heavy rain, but I'm not really getting wet because of this canopy of the huge Tetrapanax leaves, which are about a meter and a half across each individual leaf. And from side to side, this area is probably, well, a good 10 meters by 10 meters just of Tetrapanax. It's the most stunning collection of Tetrapanax I think I've ever seen in a private garden. So the rain's getting a bit too heavy for filming too much outside at the moment. So I've come into this really nice summer house which has a fantastic view of this lower part of the garden, And one of the great things about this garden is it doesn't rely on summer colour and tender plants. It's got a really great hardy backbone of evergreen exotics. So we've mentioned the bamboos and the arid beds. We've got all the palm trees as well, dominated by Trachypis fortunii in various sizes. But there's some other palms dotted about the garden as well. There's a Jabea, there's Chamaerops or Chimaerops, we've got Cerifera, and we've also got Nanarops as well. And we've got palms that come out of the greenhouses and conservatory for the summer as well. So we've got the tender ones like the Phoenix as well. And what Keith and Melissa have done is pretty incredible. They have developed a site which was a quarry into this amazing garden, which is on a scale that you rarely see in a private garden. And what's even more incredible is all this hard landscaping, all the walls, all the decking, all these buildings and structures. They've done it all themselves, and it's an incredible feat that keeps them obviously really busy year on year developing the garden. They've got so many plans for developing so many other areas of the garden which I've not shown on film today, but it's truly incredible how they've recycled materials into the walls, how they've thought about how the paths go through different areas and the views you get from the higher and lower spots in the garden as well. The huge pond, which was a natural swimming pond, is now a natural wildlife pond full of insects, getting the bird life in there, getting the grass snakes down there as well. And then as we move through the lawn area surrounded by wonderful hardy planting, and then we move up through the arid beds, sunken gardens. We've got the roof garden as well with the arids planted on that. We've got the amazing greenhouses, including the arid house with some beautiful specimens, including that variegated aloe in there as well. And then we move up to some tender plants on the tables and around where the Tetrapanax forest is basically. And all this has been done by one couple over the last 20-30 years to make an absolutely stunning garden. Really impressed and so glad I've visited this amazing garden here in Norfolk. Now what an incredible garden Melissa and Keith have down in Norfolk. So it's a huge range of really healthy, substantial plants, all grown to perfection. Now Crete Lodge, their garden, isn't open to the public, but whilst in Norfolk I took a chance to visit a garden that does open for the NGS Open Garden Scheme. During my visits to Norfolk, I couldn't resist a trip to Hellesdons' hidden Tropicanza, Sonja's garden, which is a fantastic exotic garden inspired by the late Will Giles, full of tropical, exotic looking plants, annuals and perennials. What makes this garden really special is the inclusion of many very unique tropical structures in the garden. So you've got a tiki hut with its logs. You've also got a fabulous tree house which you can climb the steps and have brilliant views overlooking the garden. Also a swing seat and various different areas with shady areas and areas in the full sun, and so much colour all the way through the garden. Fantastic if you're in the area when it's open for the NGS National Garden Scheme. Definitely well worth a visit. Sonja's garden is definitely worth visiting if you're in the area when it's open for the National Garden Scheme. Now I'm here in my mini tree fern forest under the canopy of the tree ferns and eucalyptus trees on what is a very windy day, but it is sheltered in this corner. And what I'm going to plant is this pretty unique looking fern, and I picked this up when I was down in Norfolk from Urban Jungle, which is a great exotic garden centre. And this is Dryopteris sieboldi, and it's quite unique in terms of its leaves are unlike a lot of fern leaves, they are fused together and they're nice and leathery and glaucous, and it will deal with some dry shade, but obviously ideally it wants to be moist. And I'm planting it underneath this tree fern, which has been in the ground 4 years now. And you may know that if you sort of plant tree ferns and let them establish, they root out and covers a large area, and it's really difficult to dig around them, so it's best to plant up soon after planting your tree ferns. But this has been 4 years and I've had to use my root slayer here to actually dig through the roots. So I've just pre-dug a hole, and you can see here, this is a hole I dug, and it's basically a mass of fibrous tree fern roots. Really, really packed full of roots, this area. But I think this area will be fine for this fern because it is sheltered, it is in shade, and there are drippers here and will well water this area as well. So we're just going to tip it out of the pot, and we can see that's got lots of nice fibrous roots as well. And just put that in there. And I won't be able to use this to break up to backfill because it's, like I said, just a mass of roots. So I've just got a bit of garden soil from somewhere else in the garden, and I'll just firm that around, and I'll give that a good water, and that will hopefully establish over winter. It's not too late to plant out potted plants if they're hardy. September to the end of October is a fantastic time for plants like this to establish, either sort of perennials or herbaceous perennials as well, because they'll be dying down this time of year, but the roots will get in there and establish through the last few warm weeks of the season now, and then through winter they'll just sit there and they'll grow away again next year, as long as they're not frozen through. So I wouldn't plant this if this was a freezing day. So give that a good water now, and that should do fine. And now it's time for a second look around Simon Olpin's garden in Sheffield, where he's going to talk about 2010 survivors and also some very large bamboos.
So the tree behind me is Acacia delbata subalpina. The original plant I planted in the early 2000s, and it grew phenomenally quickly in this very hot south-facing garden in Sheffield to really about 40 feet after something like 6 or 7 years. The tree itself was very hardy seemingly, and survived temperatures down to -9 with really no damage at all. And in fact the flowers survive quite a lot of frost, again without much damage. Certainly at -9 there was some damage, but certainly during the winters, most winters, the flowers are undamaged by -5s, even -6s. The very bad winter of 2010-11, where we had -12 here in Sheffield and in this garden, which was the coldest we've recorded in the last 35 years, the tree was completely killed to ground level, and there was no sign of any growth even from the trunk the following summer. In July of the following summer, a tiny sucker arose from a root which was some 12 feet away from the original tree. That tiny sucker, as a single growing shoot, was rather unstable, as it was actually on a growing from a large root, and for many years I kept cutting it back as it grew because it was not stable. As time went on, the roots established more and more, and eventually it's become a very substantial tree, which I trim back, flowers regularly, and the root system is really very solid now. And this is the tree that you see behind me. So this is my jungle area, which is a mixture of running bamboos and a couple of clumper bamboos, which are Berindra. This Berindra here is a Keith Rushforth introduction, KR3968, which is very similar to the Kris Stapleton 1046 bamboo. Very blue culms. It's essentially Berindra papyrifera. This one is collected at slightly higher altitude and maybe slightly hardier, but it's a beautiful clumping bamboo. In contrast, because I wanted to generate a jungle effect, I planted a number of runners, particularly this Bashania fargesii, which is a very much a running bamboo, has moved right across the garden in virtually all directions. It's tended to stay within the garden because it's a dry garden and I water it, so it tends to stay within the areas where there's water. It's also a very tall bamboo, so some of the culms on this bamboo, although they may not be that thick, are actually nearly 40 feet tall. And they're particularly impressive bamboo in the sense that it is a very tough bamboo, but actually generates a very nice clumping, a very much grove effect, where you can move amongst the culms over quite a large area. There's another clumper here, which is another Berinda, Keith Rushforth's introduction. Those culms too are going to well over 20 feet and are actually quite blue as well. So the overall effect is really a very dense jungle effect with tall bamboos which you can walk through and under, which is the sort of atmosphere I'm trying to create overall here. So this bamboo is Phylostachys vivax aureosulcata. It's the largest bamboo that I have, and it's probably the largest culm size in terms of bamboos that you can grow in the cooler parts of the UK. This specimen has been here for about 12 or 13 years, but it was reasonably mature planted when I put it here. So it's fed very regularly with farmyard manure or other kinds of mulch, any kind of organic matter really which is rich and moisture retentive. It grows well here. It's in reasonably good sun and reasonably warm, but the gardens, of course, at 450 feet above sea level on the edge of the Pennines don't get the sort of heat that you would get in the southeast of England. In terms of culm size, the culm size really depends on the amount of warmth the plant is getting and the amount of water and feed that it's getting. The soil temperature is important in terms of the size of the culms you're going to get. So in more recent times, as we've gone on, we've had longer summer periods when the temperature has been above 20, 25, 26. Those sort of temperatures bring higher temperatures within the soil and increase the chances of getting these large culms. And again, as I say, it depends on the soil moisture as well when the plant is growing. So it's a good bamboo to grow. The only downside is that it has very thin walls. Many culms have a much thicker wall structure, so these culms do break under heavy snow loading, which is rather disappointing because they tend to break at about 15 or 16 feet high, taking off much of the actual green growing part of the bamboo. So that is a downside where you're going to get heavy snowfall, of which Sheffield is particularly prone, so a foot of snow is not that unusual in Sheffield, but in most places that won't be a problem.
Simon has some absolutely amazing bamboos growing in Sheffield, and it just goes to show with a bit of heat, feed and lots of water, you can grow some truly huge bamboos even in the north of the UK. And also Simon talked about the cold winters in Sheffield, and a good way of knowing about your location, how cold the ground is and how cold your garden gets in winter, is obviously looking at the temperatures on the weather websites, but even better is to have your own weather station at home. And I have had this one for the last few years in use, last sort of 5 or 6 years. But as you can see, it's past its best. It was mounted, or is mounted on a pole, and it was high up, about 3 or 4 meters above the ground, which is not great for measuring temperatures at ground level, obviously, but it's great for giving a good idea of the temperature and the wind and the rain. But as with a lot of weather stations, they do degrade and stop working after a number of years. So this was working perfectly for 18 months for all the sensors. Then the water collection sensor broke, and then for the next 2 or 3 years it was really just the temperature and the wind that worked, and then the wind stopped working because the plastic's degraded, and finally the chip's gone and it's not even recording the temperatures anymore. So I have done my research and found a much better option, a much better weather station for my location. I've just had it delivered this week. I'm going to have a quick show of it to you now, and then we'll do a review of it after winter to see how it's done. So this is my new weather station that I'm really excited about because it's got no moving parts, so it shouldn't wear out quickly, and it's got a 10-year guarantee. The plastic should stay nice, bright and white, not go brittle, and it's got some really good technology in this which is not available or not seen in other weather stations, so that the top sensor actually measures rainfall by feeling the raindrops hitting the sensor, and using some clever technology actually working out the rainfall intensity and duration on this. It's got your temperature probe, it's solar powered as well, so you don't need to charge a battery, it's not mains operated, and it does obviously the pressure as well, UV, wet bulb, delta, all sorts of different measurements. So I'll be doing a full review after winter to see how it does in the UK winter. And this is the Tempest weather flow. It's not available in the UK yet, so I had to import this from Florida, but I think it's well worth the effort and the expense of the postage to get it here, because already the data has been fantastic with so many different parts of the data. And you can put it on weather flow as well, you can put it on weather underground as well, so you can compare it to other weather stations in your area and across the country. So a fantastic piece of kit for measuring the climate and the weather in your location. So now we're late in the season, we do need to thinking about bringing in the Aeoniums that have done absolutely amazing this year. I've planted up this new bed with the Trachycarpus princeps palms, we had sunflowers, and we put all these Aeoniums, which were basically large cuttings. I just snapped off the plants last autumn, brought them into the greenhouse, potted most of them up, and they're slowly rooted over winter, and then we planted them out back in May this year. But now it's time to dig them up again, and we can be quite brutal with this. We can literally just snap off the heads like so, we can just snap it like that. We might get a bit of root like that, we might not get any roots. It doesn't really matter, because it's going to go either in pots in the greenhouse, or they're going to go in a tray, pour some compost sort of roughly over the area, and give them a little bit of water, and they'll get through winter okay, provided they're in plenty of light. So they need to be in good light in the greenhouse, the top shelving areas near the windows, so that they don't get too drawn. But saying that, come spring they do look pretty poor in condition, but they soon revitalise and look good again when you plant them out and they get some decent sunlight. So I will dig up some of these properly and pot them up, but most of them I'll just sort of pull up like this and snap off and basically treat as large cuttings. And I want to introduce some colour to this area for spring, because sort of the months between obviously November, December, going all the way through to May, there's not a great deal of colour in my garden because most of the action happens in summer and autumn. So I'm going to actually plant some bulbs here, and I want the bulbs to come back year after year. So because of that, what I'm going to plant are some tulips, but not just any tulips. These are Darwin tulips. And Darwin tulips do come back year after year. A lot of other tulips do a great show one year, and then the following years they look less and less vigorous and don't flower as well. Whereas Darwin hybrids come up year after year and have big goblet shaped flowers in pretty much primary colours. So we've got red and yellow here, and I'm going to dig these in, the bulbs, very deep. In November, December is the ideal time to plant these bulbs. So once all the Aeoniums are lifted and cleared, I'll just dig over this bed and plant my tulips nice and deep, at least sort of 15 centimetres deep, maybe a bit deeper, so that next spring when we're planting out annual bedding, we won't be disturbing the bulbs. And that's all we have time for this edition of Exotic Garden UK Yorkshire Kris Weekly. I hope you found this episode entertaining and useful, and you might want to consider liking and subscribing to my channel, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.